todos y todas. So there's a minor change in the program. I will be the only one mediating this panel, and Paolo will mediate the last panel, panel number 6. I have the distinct pleasure to welcome Ranjana Khanna and Natália Félix de Souza. Ranjana is professor of English, Women's Studies, and the Literature Program at Duke University. She works on Anglo and Francophone post-colonial theory, literature, film, psychoanalysis, and feminist theory. She's published widely on transnational feminism, psychoanalysis, and post-colonial and feminist theory, literature, and film. Among her books include Dark Continents, Psychoanalysis and Colonialism, Algeria Cuts, Women and Representation, 1830 to the Present. And she's also published a number of articles worth looking at in journals like Differences, Signs, Third Text, Positions, South Atlantic Quarterly, among others. Her current book manuscripts in progress are called Asylum, The Concept and the Practice, and Technologies of Unbelonging. Natália Félix de Souza is currently professor of international relations at PUC São Paulo. She received her PhD from IRI, in which she engaged the limits of critique in international relations theory. Her work focuses mainly on critical approaches to subjectivity and subject formation, including post-structural, post-colonial, and post-human theories, and on decolonial approaches to knowledge and knowledge production. Recently, she's been involved with various initiatives regarding gender and women's studies, including the creation of Mulheres, which has been critically engaging the status of women and gender studies in Brazilian international relations. I would like to thank you all for being here, and without further ado, I'll turn it over to Ranjana.
Hello, everyone. I want to just begin by thanking Jimmy and the other organizers for inviting me to speak at this conference, and for everyone's hospitality. It's been a beautiful trip so far. I also want to especially thank the translators, the interpreters, for the work that they're doing today. Obviously, it is the first step of international relations. Nothing can happen without that, so I greatly appreciate their work. So the title of this talk is Complicity with the Living, or the Death Drive. How is it that one begins to speak on behalf of the dead and of the disposable? To do so involves a positionality that is one of complicity with the living in the face of the opposite of that. There's a way of trying to understand the forms of immersion in a language world, a life world, in which one cannot speak as if a human. Another way of thinking about this would be to ask, how does one think with the corpse? I began to try to understand this in relation to the photography of refugees. Some months ago, during a conference on the refugee crisis, a colleague asked how we understand a sequence of events as a crisis in which inaction has the possible consequence of witnessing death on a large scale. I wrote on the very beautiful prize-winning photography of refugees and art that has emerged, and the role of the aesthetic more generally in this genre, in asking us to contemplate the value of life outside economic assessment of the costs and benefits of refugees to host countries. Today, speculation is typically taken to mean engagement in risky financial transactions dependent on volatile markets. Philosophically, however, it has other meanings. For Hegel, it is a form of reason that refuses an opposition between natural consciousness and understanding, or subjective and objective, as if to reference Aristotle, and I'll return to Aristotle, and yet depart from him. Hegel explains his idea in relation to the image of a corpse. Jacques Derrida, Sarah Kaufman, Luce Irigaray, and Gayatri Spivak deconstructively understand speculation as a reaching from and between the ontic and the ontological, a resting point in productive tension between the verifiable and the non-verifiable. Once again, the corpse is central to such articulation. Refugee reached its apotheosis, if you like, with the famous picture of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian from Damascus, whose body washed ashore on a beach in Bodrum, a port city in southwest Turkey, in early September 2015. Commentators praised and condemned newspapers for printing the image, taken by Kurdish photojournalist Nilüfer Demir. Many noted that the image was modified before circulation to remove other people in the scene and to sanitize it. The image facilitates reading of the child as the pure victim, in contrast to often scapegoated adult refugees, who are less likely to evoke sympathy or recognition from host countries and their citizens. Moreover, the figure of Aylan articulates no claims and signifies as helpless rather than vulnerable, a distinction Adriano Caballero discusses in detail. Like the figure of the martyr described by Derrida in Demeure, the body signifies without representing as such. A second image of Turkish aid officer Mehmet Çıplak carrying the limp and fully dressed body of Aylan Kurdi from the shore gave virtual substance to the child's corpse. As the world retreats from death as the underside of desperate mass migration, the officer carries Kurdi's body in a manner as if to show us how to touch death while avoiding it. But the child had died recently enough that he looks like a sleeping child, not a corpse or a cadaver. If Freud, and I will return to this point in a moment, claims that modern man avoided death and could not picture himself as dead, the child seems to be dead and not dead at the same time. The spectacular image of suffering that is not suffering has an afterlife of sorts, given the attractions and aesthetics of death, of the exquisite or decaying corpse, indeed as a lesson in how to live in the face of the intolerable. What is the value of the image of Aylan? Thinking within the dominant logic of speculation on the value of refugees and migrants to Europe or any other location, a journalistic narrative commonly presents them as like us and thus live lives of equal value that deserve to be recognized as such by the decision makers of state sovereignty. What is this value, however, given the clear disposability of some lives, even most lives in the world, and particularly in the stories of mass migration? Freud's 1915 essay, Thoughts for the Time on War and Death, is a contemplation of just that. The first half of the essay is about the disillusionment that war brings, written as it is in the second year of World War I. He writes the essay to express his own disillusionment in a political system that had insisted that it was in place to protect its people, and that within what he calls the civilized nations of the world, the laws of peace would protect against mass death. He writes that with the onset of war, with tens of thousands of citizens of civilized states, and again, civilized is always in inverted commas, with tens of thousands of citizens of civilized states dying each week, comes the realization that states wanted the monopoly on the bellicose state of nature that resides in everyone. They did not want simply to protect and did not have the means, even less the desire, to negotiate peace. He describes primitive man who he's usually referring to, Australians in his use of the anthropology of the moment. He describes primitive man who knew his enemy as other and had no problem killing him. even as this primitive man imagined himself to be beyond death. The crisis comes for Freud's primitive, however, at the moment in which a loved one is killed. Freud refers to Aristotle, who in De Anima suggests that a dead body or a corpse appears more like a statue of a body than it is like a real body. It looks like a body perhaps, but it is not in fact a body at all on one level. Aristotle writes, "The body which has lost its soul is not the one which is potentially alive. This is rather the one which has a soul." De Anima. Aristotle suggests that on looking at the corpse, we provide comfort for ourselves, claiming that this contemplation of the corpse is the beginning of speculation. Aristotle thus provides what Freud would call an illusion, because for Freud, religion is an illusion, a religious rationalization that helps us believe, as we contemplate a corpse, that it is not our loved one. He or she has gone elsewhere as a soul or anima, and we are left thus with a shell or a sculpture. Freud explains how it is that modern war has changed our attitude toward death, such that these illusions are palpably figurative attempts to make sense of that which is incomprehensible to the self, its ultimate other, i.e. death. He says that while modern man may, when next to the corpse, be comforted that the loved one is not in this rotting carcass, primeval man is in a different relation of disavowal when he stands next to the corpse of a loved one and must read it as other, like the enemy he comfortably kills, and like himself, who cannot believe in his own death. It's a quotation from Freud. Quote, "It might be said that we owe the fairest flowerings of our love to the reaction against the hostile impulse which we sense within us. To sum up, our unconscious is just as inaccessible to the idea of our own death, just as murderously inclined towards strangers, just as divided, that is, ambivalent, towards those we love, as was primeval man. But how far we have moved from this primal state in our conventional and cultural attitudes towards death. It is easy to see how war impinges on this dichotomy. It strips us of the later accretions of civilization and lays bare the primal man in each of us. It compels us once more to be heroes who cannot believe in their own death." End quote. The standing alongside the dead other, then, gives rise to a form of speculation, perhaps a form of reading, that allows us to understand both a dimension of height, that is, respect for and reverence of the sanctified dead, and a dimension of disavowal, as we name and deface the other. Contemplation next to the corpse does not lie within the limits of recognition, but rather in the attempt at understanding the other with the understanding of its dimension of height, of its demand on the self to acknowledge the limitation of persona, what is given up, in other words, in the narrow form of political life that is permitted within the logic of proxy or even of portrait. In the 1970s and 1980s, many feminists invoked the intellectual history of speculation. One might think of Sarah Kaufman's magisterial essays on Freud on speculation, including her Freud and Empedocles from 1970, The Enigma of Woman from 1980, and It's Only the First Step That Costs from 1992 from Sonu Shamdasani's collection, Speculations After Freud. Luce Irigaray Speculum of the Other Woman from 1974 took the etymological origin of speculation, speculum, on board in order, in fact, to speculate on the question of origin. Like Kaufman, she investigated Freud as what Kaufman would call the gynecologist of the psyche. Beyond reflection, she understood, Irigaray understood, the speculum's play of convex and concave mirrors to highlight sexual difference as the insubstantial marker that could nonetheless record the repressed story of feminine bodily reproduction at the heart of Western philosophy, at least since the womb of Plato's cave. From an overlapping time period, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's essay Speculations on Reading Marx after Derrida from 1983, Scattered Speculations on the Question of Value from 1985, and Echo from 1993 also speak of the question, obviously, of speculation. We could usefully remind ourselves also that her most famous essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, originally carried the subtitle Speculations on Widow Sacrifice when it was first published in Wedge in 1985. Irigaray, Kaufmann and Spivak share this terrain, of course, with Jacques Derrida, whose essay To Speculate on Freud from the Postcard, in which we see how Derrida understands an exhibition of anachronistic cards of Plato paradoxically dictating to Socrates, which is an extraordinary reading of Freud's essay Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which provides an understanding of the repetition compulsion, otherwise known as the death drive. The speculative nature of the death drive insistently returns to the question of death, but ironically, as Derrida points out, through the insistence of the pleasure principle as signifying the genealogical, the patrilineal, the repressed question of reproduction, and indeed the insistence of writing oneself into a biographical account as the grandfather in the face of death. Speculation, linked as it is to a theorization of the death drive, might also give us insight into the question of how to live, with the form of world-making we may associate with living and with the speculative in the face of death or the death drive, and about a certain narcissism and self-preservation. Now, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's criticism of psychoanalysis as an imposition of one model of self onto an entire world calls us to think through the mythologies at the heart of psychoanalysis and the sometimes spurious gendering implied within them. Where narcissism is a derogatory term usually applied to women, she sees masculinity inscribing itself and once again failing to hear the distinction of the figure of Echo, fated at once to repeat, but also to be out of sync with the voice that she repeats. Thinking of Echo as both a mythological figure and one who shows us also how the time is out of joint, we could know her as the spectral, who gives us a different sense of the temporality of nationhood and of selfhood. If Narcissus could exist through Echo alone, the narcissism of European nationalism and of the consolidated ego may perhaps give ways to a discrepant temporality of coloniality and nationhood. Spivak's essay, Through the Figure of Echo, performs a number of tasks. First, she considers the ground and the legacy of the speculative in relation to science, and then shows us how the observation is both spurious and racist. She writes, quote, "It is a nice reversal of received ideas. Speculation is logically firm, science is logically ungrounded, but has an observational foundation. It will not surprise us that the science is anthropology and the observation fieldwork. Speculation about the mental life of primitive peoples, which then allows him to draw conclusions, him meaning Freud, to draw conclusions about the mental life of children, although in the sentence describing the nature of these observations, he conflates the two groups of people as though primitive peoples were childless." End quote. Implicitly, the non-verifiable that causes Freud so much anxiety is indeed speculative, even as the observational itself is non-verifiable and yet belongs to the discourse of science. While Spivak's essay criticizes the Freudian, she nonetheless uses the speculative notion in order to both criticize Freud and to expand her notion of speculation. And Echo comes to mean for her both a reading of the repressed story of yet to be realized sexual difference, the intolerable as it were, and indeed the possibility of conceiving sexual difference at all. It It also forces us to understand that what is at issue is not only a Eurocentric mythological legacy, that would be enough, but because it's European, it is of course Eurocentric. She criticizes also the inability to see within that mythology the barely audible sound of difference. And form of speculation is the non-verifiable form of the literary for her, or the aesthetic more generally. It's a form of learning to live in the face of the violent and the violable. Thus she can turn also and only to speculation in Can the Subaltern Speak, precisely because the question of a dead widow's speech in the face of death is moot. That essay, which criticizes Foucault and Deleuze for their naive and irresponsible gesture of letting prisoners speak for themselves, considers the impossibility of being understood when the language to which one has access is always someone else's attempt to position one politically. Asking of the repressed of discourse a form of speech that has to be seen or heard in the interstices and aporia of the legacy that goes into the constitution of something we may understand as widow sacrifice. In spite of making every attempt to understand an other, then, there is something that cannot be known as such through the variety of discourses within which one is constituted as a political subject or otherwise. There remains something to be read rhetorically and perhaps more importantly, speculatively, if one is to grant the possibility of incomplete knowledge and the absence of that possibility that figurative language teaches us to understand. To speak as if, in a sense, exposes the catachretic articulation of self and other, that we are vehicles without adequate reference that may be bigger or smaller than the figures that portray us. How, she is asking, does the dead other speak? Not as if within the frame of colonial discourse of sati, of widow sacrifice, nor of that of the patriarchal Hindu that rejects that faulty colonial history only in favor of another that gives her no agency. She stands then as a hanging, menstruating, polluted corpse beside herself, presenting herself as a figure of presence and absence, readable yet gone, providing a political message yet dead, a post-colonial Antigone. In closing, let me return to the aesthetics of refugee death. The Chilean poet Raul Zurita, not this, oh, hang on. Oh, where's my Raul Zurita? There, okay. In closing, let me return to the aesthetics of refugee death. The Chilean poet Raul Zurita produced a beautiful installation in response to the Aylan Kurdi image. The installation was put in place in December 2016 at the Kochi Muziris Biennale in Kerala in India. The installation invites visitors to walk through the work titled The Sea of Pain. The installation is, Zurita tells us, a kinetic poem that requires one to walk with some difficulty and read the poem on the walls, in order, in fact, to read the poem on the walls. While the photo of Aylan Kurdi's body lying on the shore became a disturbing symbol of the refugee crisis, Zurita dedicates the installation to Aylan's older brother, Galip, who also drowned with the boy's mother on the same day and washed ashore near his brother, but no one photographed him. The poem reads, "I'm not Galip Kurdi's father, but he is my son." In his installation, Zurita asks us to acknowledge the lack of relationality in modern death. There is no simple friend or enemy in struggles where we kill our neighbors or their corpses wash up on our land. All the disappeared dead of the Mediterranean and other waters and beaches, those dead from war or climate change or political imposition, exist in the sea for Zurita. The installation requires us to step into seawater and with some difficulty wade through it before we reach the words inscribed on the wall, because the sea is without inscription as such, and is the space of so much death unseen. It encourages us to conjure speculatively the lives we wade beside rather than see documented. Given the absence of the face or bodies of the lost, the installation invites us to nonetheless be part of the sea of pain and reach toward what we might understand as life in the face of the intolerable. Zurita calls on us to enter a familial relationship with the Kurdi brother who did not become an icon, to enter a solidarity beyond the patrilineal. The speculative in this form allows us to understand life and value beyond their impoverished senses as means of exchange, production, consumption, and biology. The speculative allows us to conjure value as the oscillation between life and death, of complicity that allows us to live and the impossibility of not desiring to do that, as the grasp of living in the face, or perhaps more appropriately, in the waters of the intolerable. To wade in those waters will always be an act of complicity in a world saturated with the legacy of the patrilineal colonial. Thank you.
I'll now turn it over to Natália.
Thank you. I would like to thank this audience and this morning. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I would particularly thank Jimmy and Paulinho for inviting me to be here. It's a moment of particular joy for me. I was here in 2013 when we inaugurated our first seminar on decolonizing IR. I was still a PhD student. Well, till very recently, in fact. But seeing the fruits that we have collected since then, right, and being able to be here in this place and spread some ideas and see how they are reaped around there is a very special for me. So I thank you all for inviting me to be here. My ideas here today are not as accomplished as Ranjana's. I would like to share more some working hypotheses I thought through when I tried to think through complicity. We were asked here to talk about complicity and the moment or the complicity of our post-colonial modernity, right? And in the moment I turned to think through that, I was taken back to this paper I wrote along with my friend Lara, for, in fact, the same volume on post-colonialism and IR that Martha mentioned, and where we worked out the idea or the hypothesis that Frantz Fanon and Ashish Nandi, as these two central figures for thinking through the complicity of the colonized and the colonized mind with the process of colonization, even before or even after colonization itself has ended. And we try to speculate how their similar assessments concerning the role colonial violence produced in the mentality or in the mental figurations of the colonized led them to completely, what appears at first, to completely different projects about the role of violence in political resistance, right? Whereas Fanon was working with the reality of the colonized Negro, he would work out an imaginary, spatial imaginary, where white and black were completely divided in Manichean polarities, right? So the black and the white were for him two places, the place of humanity and the place of non-humanity, as he repeats over and over again, the black is not a man. And I would like to turn back to that, right? Nandi, for his turn, when he is working particularly with a different, in fact, colonial imaginary, he's speaking more clearly about the British colonization of India. Nandi sees the use of violence, which for Fanon was the only way for rupturing this dividing line that separated humanity from non-humanity, or the white human from the black non-human or non-being. He saw this violence, this directive violence that Fanon thought was the way for rebuilding the idea of the human as itself captured inside the ideology of colonization, right? So for Nandi, violence was, at the end of the day, the colonizer game. And as long as you used violence, you could not achieve any form of real decolonization of minds. So we came to this conclusion of this differential, this similar but different project that they were carrying, thinking through the colonial mind or the colonized mind. And I would like here to test some ideas about how the human, the complicity of the category of the human with colonialism, right? Which in the end leads us to question the centrality and exclusiveness we have attached to the human as the figure of the political, as the figure of agency, and as the figure of reason and liberty, right? So I will, the ideas I brought here today are more about trying to understand how the building of the category of the human, the idea of the human, lead us to these two somehow very different scenarios, which I depicted in Fanon and Nandi concerning the role of violence as a political resistance, a form of political resistance, right? So I would like to think about the building of the category of the human, at least in a twofold articulation. First, the idea of the human as separated, demarcated from everything that is non-human, and that includes the human against the animal, the human against nature, the human against the inanimate, right? And I'm calling this separation a spatial demarcation of the human, right? So I guess this spatial demarcation of the human can be seen precisely when we look back at the Hobbesian formation of the state, right? When Hobbes describes the formation of Leviathan, we see there the attempt to build the category of the human by the exclusion of the animal, right? The idea that man is the wolf of man is, in a sense, an idea that tries to portray man without the state or outside the state as a beast, right? The man as the animal that needs to be tamed in order for men to actually be men, right? So with Hobbes, we see a spatial demarcation, a demarcation that tries to produce the Leviathan as itself a superhuman animal, an animal machine, in fact, that lets men to stand in between nature, the animal, and God, right? So this spatial demarcation of the Leviathan is what allows for men to actually to be men, no? And all the implications of the idea that men in society cannot use their freedom entirely, right? They cannot dispose of their freedom as they want. They need to have their freedom devised to work with the others, right? So this is the first imaginary that I'm calling here the spatialization of the human by its division from everything that is non-human. A second demarcation of the human that I don't think is completely articulated in Hobbes yet is what I'm calling a temporal demarcation of the human. And I guess we can see that working out with Kant, right? The definition of the Enlightenment as man's way out of its self-incurred immaturity brings out the idea that our humanity is not there yet, right? For Kant, the potential of being human is not a fact, is not yet accomplished. It has to be accomplished through time. the only thing that demarcates men from everything that is not a man, as Foucault would say, the empiric transcendental double, right? Man is different from its others because besides being an object of nature, something that is in nature and is not a cause in itself, is always caused by something else. Man is different because he can be a causality on its own. And what allows man to be a causality in its own is freedom, it's autonomy, right? So the idea of the autonomous human being is for Kant a promise. It inscribes a temporality of the human that projects the realization of our full humanity or our autonomous subject position as always in the future, as something to be accomplished, and something to be accomplished by the use not of reason as knowledge. It's not knowledge that is going to produce an autonomous man, but is in fact the will to know, right? So he will say it's a disposition, it's a will that men have to develop in order to make use of its reason. So some authors have characterized this that as Kant saying that the subject is not, the realization of the modern subject is not a matter for knowledge alone, to be accomplished through knowledge alone, but instead it's something to be achieved through morality, through a working of our virtue, through a working of the very human soul, right? So we have two inscriptions, two different complementary sometimes inscriptions of the human. One, and I'm calling here spatial because it's the realization of humanity happens in the moment we can live in the state, right? And the other is temporal because the state, while it is the only place where we can, in fact, advance our autonomy, our humanity, in fact, it cannot be in itself the only guarantee for autonomy. And this involves the working on our morality, the working in our very soul. So the inscription of two narratives of humanity. So I'm thinking through these two definitions, or the way the idea of the human came to be framed by the exclusion of both nature and the animal in one place, and of immaturity in the other place, took me back to the narratives of Fanon and Andy, right? Fanon, when he talks about the city of the colonized, he's speaking about Algeria specifically. He speaks of a city that is divided in two. He speaks of a humanity that is divided in two. He speaks of humans and non-humans, right? And that is why, in a framework that Robbie Shillian has called an exorcism, for Fanon, the only possibility of reaching humanity for the black man or for the colonized is through violence. Violence is the way to undo what colonial violence has done, which is deprive the black man from his identity, which is deprive the black man from his recognition of himself as a human being, and making him believe that the only possible way to reach humanity is to become white. It's to speak the language of the white man, right? On the other side, we have a different... Well, just to make myself clear, I see that Fanon's narrative is extremely spatialized because he's speaking precisely of this way that the human has come to exclude everything that is attached to what is not rational and therefore what is considered animal. So he speaks of the black in many ways precisely as the animal, right? So he goes back and he says, the black is the animal, the black is the savage, the black is the one that does not have the possibility to be in society. When we look at Nandi, we don't see the idea of the animal. You don't see the idea of the animal appear it appears one time in his entire book, and it's when he speaks about Aimé Césaire, which is in fact Fanon's master. So, but the animal does not appear because I think the humanity which appears in the British colonization of India is not precisely the same kind of humanity that appears in black colonization, black slavery, right? In that place, as Nandi shows us, colonization has been accomplished in India through a double move, which has been providing a homology between sexual domination and political domination. So what he says, on the one hand, India was associated with the image of an effeminate subject. And by building the idea of the female as an inferior version of the male, and what Nandi will call the female in the male being an even more abject character of the subject, this was how the mentality of colonialism was able to populate both victims and perpetrators, or in his case, the two sides of victims that colonialism produced, right? The other homology that was produced, besides the sexual homology, was the temporal homology, which was able to produce the Indian as either the infantile version, the immature version of the subject, or else as the decrepit old age version of the mature self. So we see this double narrative of sexuality and ageism or temporality inscribing the process through which Indian colonialism worked itself out, and how in Nandi the spatial metaphor is much less important than particularly the temporal metaphor through which humanity was promised to the Indians as long as they learned how to become a better version of themselves, i.e. to achieve their humanity in the future, just as the European had already achieved theirs, right? So to the black man, to Fanon's black man, humanity was denied. It was integrally denied. The black man is outside. It's spatially outside the human, the possibility of being human. And therefore, liberal humanity has to be destroyed violently in order to rebuild a form of humanity that can account for the black. As when we look to Nandi, it's a different narrative, where humanity has we already know the path to humanity through time, and we need only to teach them to be better humans. And therefore, we can all get there in the end, humans together, right? So, coming to a close, what I think, looking at these two narratives of how the demarcation of the human from its others, spatially and temporally, have worked to promote colonialism in many senses, I think there is no way of questioning or thinking through the possibility of decolonizing our mind, and let alone IR, without questioning the supremacy and exceptionality of the category of the human in our political imaginary. I think it's necessary to, and I think there are many people already thinking through it, but I think you cannot think through decolonization seriously without thinking through what we have come to call the human, and therefore to reopen our possibilities of finding the subject always in a process of never becoming together, of being with each other and being with the other things that inhabit this same earth, at least. So as we can begin to think beyond these narratives of either borders, spatial borders, or normative temporalities, in which we always produce kinds of abject subjectivities, either completely abject and therefore considered animals that we can trap in or trap out, either leave outside of our national borders or build fences and build prisons and build camps or whatever you want, and you can spatially demarcate these animal peoples and because they are not prepared to live in society. Or else you inscribe various forms of non-normative subjects, of pathologized subjects that need to be properly educated and disciplined in order to make their full entrance into humanity. And I think these two narratives, having various ways, led us to the need to think through political resistance and post-colonial resistance by thinking through what the category of the human, the supreme category of our political imaginaries, has come to mean for us. And our complicities in desiring to be autonomous, self-determining subjects and having our agency given back to us. It's a powerful imaginary. It's with us for a reason. And it's hard to get rid of because it has a reason behind it. We really need to think through our complicity with freedom, with autonomy, with sovereignty, with responsibility, with human, to think through the possibility of decolonizing our psyche, our minds, our bodies. I guess this is it. Thank you.